Today's notes are our Unit 3, Day 5 notes. These are on representations of functions or connections between the different ways we can represent functions. And so in class we did a warm-up. You can look for that video somewhere else in Schoology. It's a different video. Our notes actually start differently. I'm gonna actually go to the very back of the notes. So these are our notes that start with connections among multiple representations of functions. But I flipped that whole packet over. This is the very last page, because I feel like just a quick review of slope-intercept form and finding slope and finding the y-intercept is just going to help remember how to handle the notes that we're getting. All right, so remember, this is slope-intercept form. It's the magical formula where you can see what the slope is. It is whatever your coefficient of x is. Whatever is glued to the x tells you your slope, and your y-intercept is the letter b, which, of course, when you write this as an equation, if I have something like y equals 1/3 x plus 2, then I know my slope is 1/3 and my y-intercept is 2. Slope, what that means is on a graph, every time I am on a point, to get to the next point, I will go up 1 and then over 1, 2, 3. So if you could imagine that I had some sort of a coordinate grid there. Okay, remember that if we have a positive number representing our slope, if that's a positive number, we're going to be going uphill. So an uphill slope means we have some sort of a positive number. If I have a downhill slope, going downhill from left to right, whatever my number is that is right next to the x, whatever my coefficient of x is, it's going to be a negative number. Okay, so those are just kind of some basic important things to be thinking of. The slope tells you how far up or down your rise, or your change in y, over how far side to side, which is your change in x, to go from one point to another. And of course that letter b, whatever number you have there, it's telling you your y-intercept. It is telling you the value of y when you cross the y-axis. We can find our slope and our y-intercept by looking at a graph or a table or an equation. So just looking right here, if I want to identify slope and y-intercept, remember we just said y equals mx plus b, where m is the slope and b is the y-intercept. Okay, so for an equation like this, y equals 3x plus 4, I know my slope is 3, and I know that I'm crossing that y-axis at positive 4. In this example, y equals negative 2x plus 3, I know my slope is negative 2. I'm going to have a downhill looking graph, and I know I'm crossing that y-axis at 3. My slope here is 4, and I'm crossing the y-axis at negative 7. Okay, these are not on your actual paper, but I'm just going to show you some other quick representations. If I have a graph that looks like this, this is crossing the y-axis at negative 2. Notice that is a negative number. I'm below the origin. Over here, I'm crossing the y-axis at positive 3. I'm above the origin. This is an example of a graph that has a positive slope. This is an example of a graph that has a negative slope. All right. So if I had something like y equals 3x, and that's all I had, the slope I can see, it's the number that's attached to that x, so my slope would be 3. My b, my y-intercept, is 0, right? There's no number here. That means I'm crossing through the origin. And if I have something that gives me a fraction, negative 2/3 x, negative 2/3 x plus 5, then I know my slope, it's negative 2/3, and then I would be crossing my y-axis at b equals 5. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to think about finding slope given 2 points, and you may not have had a lot of practice on this, but hopefully this will remind you enough that you'll feel comfortable. All right, so I'm going to find slope given 2 points. And I'm going to use the equation that I've got right here. M, remember m is slope, so m is y sub 2 minus y sub 1 all over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. This is the same thing as saying the difference from one y to another, or the change in y over the change in x. That's what we're looking at. Slope is the rise over the run, it's the change in y over the change in x, or it's y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. All right, so realize that any of these subscripts right here, those are just labels. They just tell me that this y came from the second point I was talking about, and this y came from the first point I was talking about. I don't do any math with this number 2 or with this number 1. Those are just labels. Right, so if I'm looking at this ordered pair, this is my first point. That means that this is x sub 1, and this is y sub 1. If this is my second point, this is x sub 2, and this is y sub 2. Right? So if I use this equation, I can say my slope is going to be y sub 2 minus y sub 1. I just plug stuff in. Y sub 2 is negative 13 minus y sub 1, that's negative 1. I don't want to lose my negative. I'm subtracting a negative, so I'm going to put that in parentheses. Over my x sub 2, 10, minus my x sub 1, 2. If I subtract a negative, I'm really adding a positive. So I have negative 13 plus 1 here, so that's negative 12. Over 10 minus 2 is 8, and I can simplify that to, negative 3 halves. All right, example 2, I'm going to do the same exact math. I'm going to write it a little bit differently, though. This is my point 1, and this is my point 2. So this is y sub 2, this value, this 6, right? So I'm going to say y sub 2 minus y sub 1. I want that in the numerator, and so I'm using my rainbow arrow up top because I want that in my numerator. Now I'm going to write 6 minus 3. That's all over the change in x. So I'm going to go 4 minus negative 5. So that goes in the denominator, so my arrow's below. 4 minus negative 5. This equals 3 over 9, which is the same as 1/3. So I did exactly the same math that I would have done if I had labeled this x sub 1, y sub 1, x sub 2, y sub 2. I just kind of did a shortcut and just used my rainbow arrows to help me. All right, so we can find slope given 2 points. We can find slope by looking at an equation and finding m, and we can also find slope given a graph. So when we look at a graph to find the slope, we are finding the change in y over the change in x. If this is my first point and that's my second point, the change in height is going to be whomp, whomp. I had to go up 2 to get to the same level as my second dot, and then whomp, over 1. So I had to go up 2 and over 1, which I can simplify as just 2, right? My slope is 2 there. Change in y over change in x. And I also will always kind of look at my graph. This is a positive slope, so I'm expecting my number to be positive. If it had been a negative slope, I would have had to go down some number and then over some number. So just make sure your answer is positive or negative as you expect it to be. All right, so that's just our review of slope and intercept. And so stay tuned or come back and you can see me go through the notes for U3D5 today.